You don't belong here. The words didn't come loud, but they cut through the low hum of clinking glasses and quiet jazz like a knife sliding across polished marble, and for a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to pause without anyone fully understanding why. The chandeliers above continued to glow warm and golden, reflections dancing across crystal and silver, but something in the air shifted, something tight and unseen. As if even the room itself had taken a breath and forgotten how to let it go, and standing near the edge of table 12, barely tall enough to see over the white linen, Lila Brooks froze with a tray balanced carefully in her small hands, the condensation from 2 glasses of ice water dampening her fingers as she looked up, not startled, not angry, just still, her dark eyes steady in a way that didn't match her size or the worn sneakers peeking out beneath her too big uniform. The kind that had been folded and pinned to fit her frame. Across from her, seated like he owned not just the restaurant but the very idea of space within it, Jonathan Hale leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the leather, his watch catching the light with a quiet flash that said more about power than any introduction ever could, his expression calm, almost amused, as if he had said something completely ordinary, something expected, something deserved, and yet the people around him shifted in their seats, glancing between the man and the girl with a discomfort they couldn't quite name. Because it wasn't just what he said, it was how easily he said it, how natural it sounded coming from someone who had never once been questioned in rooms like this. Lila didn't move right away, didn't lower her gaze the way most would, didn't rush to apologize or disappear into the background where she was supposed to exist. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the tray, careful not to spill, careful not to give anyone a reason to dismiss her further, and then, slowly, she stepped forward, placing the glasses down one by one with a precision that felt almost deliberate, each soft clink against the table echoing louder than it should have, until the silence grew thick enough that even the pianist in the corner hesitated, his fingers hovering just above the keys. Jonathan watched her with a faint smile, tilting his head slightly, studying her the way someone might study a puzzle they weren't sure was worth solving, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, smoothing it flat against the table with the same casual authority he used to sign deals worth millions. "Tell me something," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, the kind that didn't need to rise to command attention. "Do you know what this is?" Lila's eyes flicked down to the paper, but she didn't answer, not yet, because she understood something that most people in that room didn't, something quiet and important about moments like this, that sometimes the real test wasn't in what was asked, but in why it was being asked at all, and Jonathan seemed to sense that hesitation, or maybe he mistook it for uncertainty, because his smile widened just a fraction. Enough for the people closest to him to notice, enough for a ripple of anticipation to move through the tables nearby. "It's a problem," he continued, tapping the paper lightly with his finger. "One that stumped people a lot older than you." A soft chuckle followed from someone at the neighboring table, quickly stifled, as if they weren't sure whether it was safe to laugh. "Solve this," Jonathan said, leaning forward now, his eyes locking onto hers with a sharpness that cut through the room. "And I'll give you everything." The words landed heavy, not because of their volume, but because of the weight behind them, the kind of promise that sounded impossible and yet completely believable coming from a man like him. And for a second, no one spoke, no one moved, even the air seemed to wait, as if the entire room had become a stage and everyone knew it, everyone except the one person who refused to play her part. Lila finally looked up, meeting his gaze fully now. And there was something in her expression that didn't match the expectation hanging over her. Something calm, something measured, as if she had heard this kind of tone before, as if she understood the difference between a challenge and a trap, and without rushing, without asking permission, she reached for the paper, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge, the smallest movement, but enough to shift the balance of the moment, because suddenly it wasn't just a test anymore, it was something else entirely, something neither Jonathan nor anyone else in that room could fully predict, and as she lifted the page and looked down at it, the faintest crease forming between her brows, the room leaned in without realizing it, drawn not by the promise of what might happen, but by the quiet, undeniable feeling that whatever came next was not going to go the way anyone expected. The paper felt thinner than she expected, almost fragile between her fingers, the edges slightly worn as if it had been folded and unfolded more times than anyone in that room would admit, and Lila's eyes moved across the lines slowly, not rushing, not reacting, just reading, while around her the silence began to shift into something else, something less patient, because people were not used to waiting on someone like her. Not in a place like this, and a soft murmur started to ripple from table to table, low voices brushing against one another like restless wind. "Does she even understand it?" someone whispered just loud enough to be heard, followed by a faint chuckle that was quickly masked behind a glass being lifted, and near the bar a man in a gray suit leaned closer to his companion, shaking his head with quiet certainty, as if the outcome had already been decided before the moment even began. Jonathan Hale remained still, watching her, his expression composed but his fingers now tapping once against the table, a subtle, almost unconscious movement that betrayed a flicker of impatience, because he was used to control, used to immediate results, used to people either impressing him quickly or failing just as fast, and this quiet, steady pause did not fit into either category. "You can speak," he said finally, his tone smooth but edged now, as if offering permission while also reminding her of her place. "Or is it too much?" A few more smiles appeared around the room, not cruel enough to be called laughter, but not kind enough to be anything else, and for a brief moment the weight of expectation pressed down harder, not just on Lila, but on the entire space, as if everyone was leaning forward, waiting for her to shrink, to hesitate, to confirm what they already believed. But Lila did not look up, not yet, her eyes still fixed on the page, tracing each line with a focus that felt almost out of place in a room built for distraction and display. And then, very softly, she spoke, not to the room, not even to Jonathan, but almost to herself. "This is not a real problem." The words were quiet, almost lost beneath the hum of the air conditioning and the distant clink of silverware, but they landed with a strange clarity, like a note played slightly off from the expected melody, and for a second, no one reacted, because they were not sure they had heard correctly. Jonathan's tapping finger stopped, just for a beat, before he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing with interest rather than amusement now. "I beg your pardon?" he said, his voice lower, more focused, and this time Lila lifted her gaze, meeting his directly, her expression unchanged, calm, steady. "It looks like one," she continued, holding the paper lightly in front of her. "But it is missing something." A few brows furrowed, a couple of guests exchanged glances, the earlier confidence in the room beginning to crack at the edges, because this was not the response they expected. Not confusion, not silence, but something else entirely, something that did not fit neatly into the role they had assigned her. Jonathan leaned back slightly, studying her again, but this time there was no smile, only a sharp, calculating look. "Missing something?" he repeated, as if testing the words in his own mind, and Lila nodded once, a small, deliberate movement. "You cannot solve it the way it is written," she said, her voice still soft, but now carrying just enough to reach beyond their table to brush against the ears of those who had been pretending not to listen. "Because it does not tell you everything you need to know." The room shifted again, the murmurs returning but different now, less certain, more questioning, and near the back someone let out a quiet breath they did not realize they had been holding. Jonathan's gaze sharpened, a flicker of something passing through his expression, not quite doubt, not quite surprise, but something closer to recognition, the kind that comes when a conversation begins to move in an unexpected direction. "Then tell me," he said slowly, his voice measured, controlled. "What is it missing?" And for the first time since she had stepped into this moment, Lila allowed herself the smallest pause, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, as if she understood that the next words mattered more than anything that had come before, and when she spoke again, her voice was still quiet, still steady, but now it carried something else beneath it, something that shifted the balance of the room in a way no one could ignore. "The truth about how it was made." For a moment, no one spoke, not because they understood what she meant, but because they did not expect her to say anything that required understanding, and that silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind that makes people shift in their seats and glance at one another for cues that never come, and Jonathan Hale did not break it immediately, which in itself was unusual. Because he was a man who filled silence with control, not questions, but now he simply watched her. His eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to see past what was in front of him, as if searching for something that did not match the picture he had already formed. Lila held the paper steady, her small fingers no longer trembling from the weight of the tray but now still with purpose, and she lowered her gaze back to the page, not to read it again, but to point, her finger stopping at a line near the center. "Right here," she said softly, turning the paper just enough so that Jonathan could see. Though she did not step closer, she did not need to, because the entire table leaned in without realizing it, drawn by the quiet certainty in her voice. "You skipped a condition," she continued, her tone calm, almost instructional, as if she were not speaking to a billionaire but simply explaining something that had been overlooked, and a faint crease appeared between Jonathan's brows, not irritation, not yet, but something closer to concentration, the kind he reserved for negotiations and high-stakes decisions, not for a child standing in front of him. "There is always a condition," she added, lifting her eyes again, and this time there was a subtle shift in the room, a change so small it could have been missed, but it was there, the first crack in the assumption that had filled the space moments ago, because now people were no longer waiting for her to fail, they were waiting to see if she might be right, and that possibility alone was enough to unsettle them. Jonathan reached forward, taking the paper from her hand, his fingers brushing the edge where hers had been, and he scanned it quickly, then again more slowly, his jaw tightening just slightly as his eyes moved across the lines he had clearly memorized long before tonight, and for a second, just a second, his confidence flickered, not enough for most to notice, but enough for the rhythm of his breathing to change, enough for his posture to shift from relaxed control to something more alert. "It is all there," he said, but his voice was different now, still steady, but no longer amused, no longer dismissive, and Lila did not argue, she did not raise her voice or try to prove him wrong in the way most people would, instead she simply tilted her head slightly, as if considering him rather than the problem. "Then solve it," she replied, and the words were not a challenge, not a dare, but something far more unsettling, an invitation, quiet and direct, that placed the weight of the moment back where it belonged, and the room felt it instantly, the shift, the reversal, subtle but undeniable, because now it was no longer about whether she could solve the problem, it was about whether he actually could. Jonathan's fingers tightened around the paper, just enough to crease it slightly, and he exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping back to the page as if seeing it for the first time, really seeing it, not as a tool for control, not as a performance, but as something that needed to be understood, and the seconds stretched, 1, then 2, then 3, long enough for the earlier murmurs to fade completely, long enough for the entire restaurant to fall into a silence that was no longer imposed, but chosen, because no one wanted to miss what came next. Lila stood where she was, her hands now resting at her sides, empty, patient, her posture relaxed in a way that did not match the tension in the room, and her eyes remained on Jonathan. Not with defiance, not with fear, but with a quiet steadiness that made it impossible to look away, and somewhere near the back, a glass was set down just a little too carefully, the soft sound echoing louder than it should have, marking the moment as something different, something that had already begun to change, even before anyone spoke again. Jonathan did not answer right away, and that alone was enough to ripple through the room like a quiet shock. Because men like him did not pause, they decided, they concluded, they moved forward without hesitation, but now his eyes remained locked on the paper, scanning the same lines again and again as if repetition might force clarity where certainty had once lived, and the faint crease between his brows deepened, not dramatically. Not enough for most to notice, but enough to change the way his face held itself, enough to strip away that effortless confidence that had filled the space earlier. He shifted slightly in his chair, the leather beneath him making a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have, and for the first time since the moment began, his posture was no longer relaxed, no longer claiming the room, but adjusting to it, responding to something he could not immediately control, and across from him. Lila did not move, did not speak, did not rush to fill the silence, because she understood something he was only beginning to feel, that the power in the room had already started to move, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a slow, undeniable shift that could not be undone. "There is no missing condition," Jonathan said finally, his voice measured, but there was a slight delay before the words came, a fraction of a second that stretched just enough to be felt, and a few heads around the room nodded automatically, as if relieved to return to something familiar, something predictable. But Lila's expression did not change, her gaze steady, patient, waiting, not for his words, but for what lay beneath them. "Then why has no one solved it?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost gentle, and the question did not sound like defiance, it sounded like curiosity, the kind that could not be dismissed easily, because it did not attack, it invited, and that made it far more difficult to ignore. Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in thought, and he looked up at her again, really looked this time, not at her clothes, not at her place in the room, but at her, and something about that moment lingered longer than it should have, as if he was trying to reconcile two ideas that refused to fit together, the child in front of him and the weight of the question she had just asked. "Because it is complex," he replied, though the words felt less certain than before, and Lila nodded once, as if acknowledging the answer without fully accepting it. "No," she said softly, "because it is incomplete." And this time the room reacted, not loudly, but visibly, a shift in posture, a tightening of attention, the subtle leaning forward of bodies that had once leaned back in dismissal, and somewhere near the bar, a man who had been checking his phone slowly set it down, his eyes now fixed on the exchange unfolding before him. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping once more against the table, but the rhythm was different now, less controlled, less certain, and he looked back down at the paper, his mind working through possibilities he had never considered necessary before, retracing steps he had once believed were flawless, and the seconds stretched again, longer this time, heavier, until even the quiet hum of the room seemed to fade into the background. "Explain," he said at last, the single word carrying more weight than anything he had said before, not because of its volume, but because of what it represented, an opening, a shift, a willingness, however small, to step outside the certainty he had built around himself, and Lila took a small breath. Not nervous, not rushed, just steady, as she reached out and lightly tapped the edge of the paper again, guiding his attention without taking control. "You assumed the starting point," she said, her voice calm, clear, "but you never proved it." And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not forceful, but undeniable, and Jonathan's eyes flickered, just for a moment, as something clicked, something subtle but significant, the kind of realization that does not arrive all at once, but unfolds piece by piece, until it can no longer be ignored. The room held its breath again, but this time it was different, not waiting for her to fail, not waiting for him to dismiss her, but waiting for what came next, because somewhere between the first word he had spoken and this moment now, the balance had shifted, and everyone could feel it, even if no one dared to say it out loud. The realization did not arrive all at once, it unfolded slowly, like a thread being pulled from something tightly woven, and Jonathan Hale felt it before he fully understood it, a subtle shift in the way the problem sat in his mind, no longer solid, no longer complete, but slightly off, slightly unbalanced, and his fingers tightened around the paper as his eyes moved back to the line Lila had pointed to, reading it again. Not as something he had written or chosen, but as something that could be questioned, and that alone was enough to unsettle him in a way he had not experienced in years. "The starting point," he murmured under his breath, the words barely audible, but close enough for Lila to hear, and she did not interrupt, did not rush to explain further, because she understood that this part mattered, the moment when someone began to see for themselves, when the answer no longer came from outside, but from within, and the room seemed to lean even closer, the quiet stretching into something almost tangible, as if everyone present could feel that something important was happening, even if they could not yet name it. Jonathan straightened slightly, his posture no longer relaxed but engaged, and he traced the structure of the problem with his finger, step by step, assumption by assumption, until he reached the beginning, and there, just as she had said, was the gap, small, almost invisible at first glance, but undeniable once seen, a missing justification, a leap that had been accepted without proof, and his jaw tightened as the realization settled deeper, not dramatic, not explosive, but steady, undeniable, like a quiet truth that refused to be ignored. He looked up at her again, and this time there was no trace of amusement, no hint of dismissal, only focus, sharp and clear. "You are saying the foundation is wrong," he said, his voice lower now, more measured, and Lila gave a small nod, her eyes steady. "I am saying it was never proven," she replied, and the distinction mattered, not an accusation, not a rejection, but a correction, precise and careful, the kind that did not attack but revealed. A soft murmur moved through the room again, different from before, no longer filled with doubt or quiet laughter, but with something closer to curiosity, even respect, and a woman near the window leaned forward slightly, her expression intent, as if watching something unfold that she had not expected to witness when she first sat down for dinner. Jonathan exhaled slowly, setting the paper flat on the table, smoothing it once more as if trying to regain control over something that no longer responded the way it once had, and for a brief moment, he closed his eyes. Not in frustration, but in concentration, reconstructing the problem. From the ground up, removing the assumption, testing the structure without it, and what remained was incomplete, unstable, unsolved, and when he opened his eyes again, there was a quiet shift in them, something subtle but unmistakable, the moment when certainty gives way to understanding. "Then it cannot be solved as it is," he said, not to her, not to the room, but almost to himself, and the words carried a weight that settled over the space, because they were not a defense, not a dismissal, but an acknowledgement, and that was something no one in the room had expected from him. Lila remained still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture unchanged, because for her, this was not about winning, not about proving someone wrong, but about seeing clearly, and she watched him with the same quiet steadiness as before, waiting, not for recognition, not for praise, but for the moment to reach its natural end. Jonathan's gaze shifted once more, from the paper to her, and then briefly around the room, as if becoming aware again of the audience that had witnessed the entire exchange. The people who had expected a performance, and were now watching something else entirely, something quieter, something more real, and when his eyes returned to Lila, there was a question there, unspoken but present, one that had not existed when this began, and the room felt it, the change, the turning point, the moment when the challenge he had given was no longer his to control, and for the first time that evening, the outcome was no longer certain, not to him, not to anyone. The question did not need to be spoken out loud for it to exist, it lingered in the space between them, in the way Jonathan Hale held her gaze just a second longer than necessary, in the way his hand remained resting on the paper instead of pulling it back as he had done so easily before, and the entire room felt it, that quiet shift from control to curiosity, from certainty to something far less comfortable. Something that required listening. Jonathan leaned back slightly in his chair, but this time the movement did not reclaim the room, it measured it, his eyes narrowing not in dismissal, but in thought, as if he were recalculating not just the problem, but the moment itself. "Then tell me," he said slowly, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "If it cannot be solved as it is, what would make it solvable?" And the question carried weight, not because it challenged her, but because it acknowledged her, and that alone sent a subtle ripple through the people watching, a realization that the exchange had moved beyond a test into something far more meaningful. Lila did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she understood that this was the moment where most people rushed, where they tried to prove themselves, to fill the silence with answers, but she had learned something different, something quieter, and she let the pause settle, her eyes drifting briefly back to the paper, then to Jonathan, and finally to the table itself, as if tracing the path of the conversation before stepping forward again. "You have to define where it begins," she said at last, her voice calm, steady. "Not assume it." And her words were simple, almost too simple, but they landed with a clarity that made them impossible to ignore. Jonathan's brow furrowed slightly, and he leaned forward. Again, his attention fully engaged now, no longer divided between performance and perception, but focused entirely on what she was saying. "Define it how?" he asked, and this time there was no trace of superiority in his tone, only inquiry, and that difference did not go unnoticed by those around them, because it marked something that rarely happened in rooms like this, a shift in who was leading the conversation. Lila reached out again, lightly tapping the top of the page. "You started with a number that was never proven to exist," she explained, her finger tracing the first line. "So everything after it depends on something that might not even be true." And as she spoke, the logic unfolded not as an attack, but as a correction, each word placed carefully, deliberately, until the structure of the problem began to look different, not flawed in a dramatic way, but incomplete in a way that could not be ignored once seen. Jonathan followed her finger, his eyes moving with it, and for a moment, he did not speak, because he could see it now, not as a possibility, but as a fact, the missing foundation, the unproven assumption, the quiet gap that had been there all along, hidden beneath layers of complexity that made it easy to overlook, and his hand lifted slightly from the table, hovering above the paper as if unsure whether to hold onto it or let it go. "So if I define it," he said slowly, thinking through the implications as he spoke. "If I establish that starting point." His voice trailed off, not because he did not know how to finish the sentence, but because he was already seeing where it led, and Lila nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Then it becomes real," she said, "and then you can solve it." And the simplicity of her answer settled into the room with a weight that felt disproportionate to its size, because it was not just about the problem anymore, it was about something larger, something deeper, something that extended beyond the paper on the table. A man near the center of the room leaned back slowly, exhaling as if he had been holding his breath for far too long, while a woman at the bar placed her hand over her glass without lifting it, her eyes fixed on Lila with a look that had shifted from curiosity to something closer to admiration, and even the pianist in the corner, who had resumed playing softly, seemed to lower the volume of his notes, as if unwilling to disturb the moment that had taken shape. Jonathan looked at Lila again, really looked, not at her role, not at her place, but at her, and there was something different in his expression now. Something that had not been there before, not surprise, not disbelief, but recognition, the kind that does not come from being impressed, but from understanding that something true has been revealed, something that cannot be dismissed or undone. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that shift, subtle but unmistakable. "And you saw that, just by reading it?" he asked, and the question was not skeptical, not challenging, but genuine, and Lila met his gaze without hesitation, her answer as steady as everything that had come before. "No," she said softly. "I saw it. Because you never checked it." And the words landed with a quiet finality, not sharp, not harsh, but precise, like a key turning in a lock that had been closed for far too long. And the room felt it, the shift completing itself, the balance settling into a new place where it could no longer return to what it had been before. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and quiet, like something that had been waiting too long to be said, and for the first time that evening, Jonathan Hale did not respond immediately, not with a counterpoint, not with a question, not even with a measured dismissal. He simply looked at her, his gaze steadied but different now, as if he were seeing not just the answer she had given, but the path that led to it, and the silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable, it was intentional, chosen, held carefully by every person in the room who sensed that something had shifted beyond the surface of the moment. Jonathan's hand slowly released the paper, letting it rest flat against the table as if it no longer belonged to him in the same way, and he leaned back again. But this time the movement did not carry authority, it carried thought, reflection, a recalibration of something internal that could not be rushed, and his eyes briefly moved away from Lila, scanning the room, not to reclaim it, but to acknowledge it, the witnesses, the expectation that had once been his ally and was now simply present, neutral, observing. When his gaze returned to her, there was no trace of the earlier amusement, no shadow of dismissal, only a quiet clarity that had not been there before. "You are right," he said, and the words were simple, almost understated. But they carried a weight that settled across the room with undeniable force, because they were not just an admission about a problem, they were something rarer, something more difficult, an acknowledgement from a man who was not accustomed to being corrected, especially not in public, especially not by someone he had already decided did not belong. A soft shift moved through the room, not applause, not reaction, but recognition. The kind that changes how people sit, how they look, how they listen. And near the far table, someone straightened slightly, their posture reflecting a new awareness of the moment they were part of. Lila did not smile, did not react in any visible way, because for her, the point had never been to hear those words, it had been to say what was true, and she stood there with the same calm presence she had held from the beginning, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze steady. Not searching for approval, not expecting reward, Jonathan exhaled slowly. A quiet breath that seemed to release something he had been holding without realizing it, and he leaned forward again, his attention no longer divided, no longer guarded, but open in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him. "I did not check it," he said, more to himself than to her, the realization now fully formed, no longer tentative, and he nodded once, as if confirming something internally, something that extended beyond the paper, beyond the problem, into a pattern he had not questioned before. His eyes lifted again, meeting hers with a different kind of focus, not evaluating, not testing, but understanding. "Most people would have tried to solve it anyway," he added, his voice quieter. Now, almost reflective. "They would have worked around the gap, filled it with assumption, convinced themselves it was complete." And there was no accusation in his tone. Only observation, the kind that comes after seeing something clearly for the first time. Lila tilted her head slightly, considering his words before responding. "That is easier," she said softly. "But it is not true." And the simplicity of her answer settled into the space between them, reinforcing what had already been revealed, not adding to it, but grounding it. Jonathan gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to challenge, only the quiet presence of what had already been understood, and the room felt it, the completion of something that had begun as a test and ended as something else entirely, something that had shifted not just the balance of power, but the meaning of the moment itself. And then, slowly, Jonathan reached forward once more, but this time not for the paper, not for control, but for something else, something less tangible. As if he were preparing to respond not as the man who had issued the challenge, but as someone who had just learned something he could not ignore, and the air in the room seemed to hold steady, waiting, not for a conclusion, but for what would come next, knowing that whatever it was, it would not return things to the way they had been before. Jonathan's hand hovered just above the table for a moment longer before he finally let it rest, his fingers no longer reaching for control, no longer tapping in quiet impatience, but still, grounded, as if he had decided not to interrupt what had already taken shape, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something that had not been there at the beginning, not authority, not performance, but intention. "You said if it is defined, it becomes solvable," he began slowly, his eyes steady on Lila. "So tell me, what would you define?" And the question did not feel like a test anymore, it felt like an opening. A space he was offering rather than controlling, and the room felt it immediately, the shift from challenge to invitation, subtle but undeniable. Lila glanced down at the paper once more, then back at him, her expression unchanged but her eyes thoughtful, as if weighing not just the answer, but the moment itself, and she took a small step closer to the table, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity, placing herself within the space that had once excluded her, and she reached for the paper again, turning it slightly, adjusting its position so that both of them could see it clearly, a quiet gesture that redefined the dynamic without announcing it. "I would start here," she said, her finger resting at the very first line, the place he had overlooked before, and her voice remained calm, measured, but there was a quiet certainty in it now that filled the space without needing to rise. "You have to prove this value exists before you build anything on top of it." And as she spoke, Her finger traced the structure downward, not solving, not rushing, but rebuilding, step by step, as if she were laying a foundation that had never been there to begin with. And Jonathan followed her movement closely, his attention fully engaged, no longer dividing the moment with anything else, not the room, not the audience, not even himself. "And if it does not?" he asked, his voice softer now, less about control and more about understanding, and Lila looked up at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Then the answer you are looking for does not exist," she replied, and the words landed with a quiet weight that settled deeper than anything before, because they did not just challenge the problem, they challenged the expectation behind it, the assumption that every question must have an answer, that every challenge must lead to a solution, and the room felt it, that shift in thinking, that subtle disruption of something long accepted without question. Jonathan leaned back slightly, not retreating, but absorbing, and his eyes moved from the paper to her and then briefly to the space around them, as if measuring the impact of what had just been said, and for a moment he said nothing, because there was nothing immediate to say. Only something to understand, and that pause, that quiet reflection, held more weight than any response could have, because it marked a change not just in the conversation, but in him. A woman near the center of the room placed her hand lightly over her chest, not in shock, but in recognition, while a man at the bar gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging something he had not expected to witness when he walked in that evening. And even the soft music in the background seemed to fade just enough to let the moment stand on its own. Jonathan's gaze returned to Lila, and there was no distance left in it now, no barrier of assumption or role, only a quiet respect that had formed without announcement, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that change clearly. "So the real answer is knowing when there is none," he said, and it was not a question, not exactly, but a realization spoken out loud, something he had arrived at through her, not because of her position, but because of her clarity, and Lila gave a small nod, her expression steady. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the truth is not in solving it, but in seeing it clearly." And the words settled into the space between them, not dramatic, not forceful, but complete, like the final piece of something that had been building quietly from the very beginning, and the room held that completion, not with applause, not with noise, but with a stillness that carried more meaning than any reaction could, because everyone there understood, in their own way, that something had just shifted, something that could not be undone, and that whatever came next would no longer belong to the man who had started the challenge, but to the truth that had been revealed. The stillness did not break all at once, it softened, like a room slowly remembering how to breathe again, and Jonathan Hale remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze steady on Lila, not searching for something more, not trying to reclaim anything that had shifted, but simply acknowledging what had already been said, what had already been understood, and then, slowly, he reached into his jacket once more. The same movement that had begun this moment, but now it carried a different weight. Not authority, not performance, but intention, and when his hand emerged, it was not another paper, not another challenge, but a simple card, clean, understated, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be recognized. He placed it gently on the table between them, not sliding it forward, not pushing it toward her, but setting it down as something offered, not imposed, and his voice, when he spoke, was quieter than it had been at any point that evening. "I said I would give you everything," he began, and there was no trace of irony, no hint of spectacle, only a straightforward acknowledgement of his own words. "But I think you already have something far more valuable than that." And the statement did not sound like praise, it sounded like realization, the kind that does not need to be exaggerated to be understood. Lila's eyes flicked briefly to the card, then back to him, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, not drawn toward it, not dismissing it either, simply seeing it for what it was, and for a moment neither of them moved, because the meaning of the gesture did not need to be rushed, it was already clear. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table, his posture no longer guarded, no longer elevated above the space, but part of it, and he met her gaze again. "If you ever want to use that," he said, nodding lightly toward the card, It will open any door I can open. And the words were not grand, not theatrical, but they carried a sincerity that made them heavier than any promise of wealth could have been, because they were not about giving something away, they were about recognizing something that could not be taken. The room remained quiet, not because people were unsure how to react, but because they understood that this moment did not belong to them, it belonged to the space between the two of them, to the shift that had taken place without permission, without announcement, and near the back, someone who had once leaned away now leaned forward, not to see better, but to understand more. Lila looked at the card again, just for a second, and then she gently slid it back across the table, her movement slow, deliberate, not rejecting, not dismissing, but choosing, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet steadiness it had held from the beginning. "I did not do it for that," she said, and there was no defiance in her tone, no pride meant to impress, only truth, simple and clear, and Jonathan did not interrupt, did not try to persuade or insist, because he recognized that tone now, he understood what it meant, and he nodded once, a small, respectful acknowledgement that carried more weight than any argument could have. Lila took a small step back then, her hands returning to her sides, her posture the same as when she had first stood there, but something had changed, not in her, but in how the room saw her, how it held her presence, and as she turned slightly, preparing to return to where she had been before this moment began, there was no sense of her leaving something behind. Only the quiet understanding that she had given something instead, something that would remain long. After she walked away, Jonathan watched her for a moment, not calling her back, not adding anything more, because there was nothing left to say that would not lessen what had already been said, and as she moved away, the soft sounds of the restaurant slowly returned, glasses clinking, voices rising just enough to fill the space again, but the atmosphere did not return to what it had been, it could not. Because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone or ignored, and at the center of it all, the paper still rested on the table, unchanged, unsolved, but no longer incomplete in the same way, because now it had revealed something far more important than an answer, something that neither wealth nor power could replace. And as Jonathan finally leaned back in his chair once more, his gaze drifting briefly to the space where Lila had stood, there was no trace of the man who had spoken those first words, only someone quieter, someone who had learned, in a way he would not forget, that the most valuable truths are not the ones you solve, but the ones you are willing to see.